Thank you, Tom, and Tom, for being part of this incredibly successful summit. Just a couple of brief questions without notice for you. Most obvious one is, how would you describe the science of learning? And how important is it to the teaching profession?
I think the science of learning is really about understanding how learning takes shape in your long-term memory from the initial inputs and the barriers that children experience on that journey, and then understanding a lot about how we then can forget things if we don't use them. So it's that understanding of knowledge taking form, schema building, that kind of wider understanding of concepts and how it links to your kind of experience. I mean, that's how I'd frame it in a very simple terms.
I think the science of learning is the application of the scientific method to teaching and learning, which is something that didn't happen for a very long time. And now all of a sudden we're drawing upon some really low-hanging fruit from things like cognitive psychology, developmental psychology and so on, to look at basic things like motivation and focus and retention and instruction and so on, and how these things are best done and when it works and when it doesn't work, because the science of learning isn't just one thing. It doesn't come up with certainties. In empirical science, nothing does. But what we're looking for are best bets and highly likelies and most probables. And I think that's what we should be looking for. And I think it's very easy to attack the concept of science of learning, because if it presumes to be one thing, then people think, well, it's a settled matter, and it never is.
Let's just talk for a moment about this idea of attacks on the science of learning. We know that there are large swathes of academia that would perhaps reject the notion, even though we would say it's strongly evidence-based. Do you have an answer to those objections?
I mean, if I could take this one, because I'm often the recipient of these attacks. I think that for many people, particularly the traditional gatekeepers of education in the days prior to a science of learning, they very frequently enjoyed status, privilege, authority and prestige by being the people who told everyone else how to do it. But often these were arguments based on authority. And so you often have people who are very, very invested in teaching practices and pedagogies and methodologies which actually achieve the opposite of what they've intended to do. And these people are so invested frequently in their own processes that it would be an act of extraordinary cognitive dissonance for them to admit that they had actually become what they didn't want to be, which is impeding children's learning frequently. It's very rarely done maliciously, but I think that very frequently the attacks on the science of learning are done for very personal reasons.
And I think that sometimes people overplay the idea that teacher autonomy or teacher freedoms are somehow shackled by some kind of constraints, like we're having these ideas imposed on them, rather than them giving us tools to actually liberate us and be much more effective in the classroom because we know more precisely what might work. And I think there's also a misunderstanding around studies about with a specific condition. So if you do a study with a certain group of students on a certain test, you get some generalized learning that comes from that, which of course teachers then have to apply to my subject, my class, my context. But people like to sort of sever that as if there's no validity in the transfer. But of course there is. You have a general understanding about retrieval, about the idea of making connections between one idea and another. That could come from a research study that's got a certain effect. It doesn't mean that you have to reproduce those identical conditions for there to be value in the research. And I find that critique falls away. Lots of teachers really benefit from having a really good understanding that we have to get children to generate ideas, to practice using things, to break things down into small steps. All these very useful ideas that really help teachers teach better. I don't really understand the critique, to be honest. I think people need to just understand that it's got a nice holistic view. It's nothing against the idea of educating the whole child and all the sort of social and emotional elements of learning are still fully embedded in the cognitive science model.
I think also in the academy, there are frequently some very deeply seated political, ideological biases which lead people to find the science of learning contentious because they view it as a turf war. They view it as some kind of battle between who gets to say what. And very frequently people in the more traditional teacher training institutions have viewed education through, for example, a social justice lens, which is great, but maybe not the best place to start when you're learning to be a teacher. And then maybe reading Paulo Freire can come perhaps a little bit further on down the line after you've learned how to actually manage a class and do some basic things like instruction, assessment, and so on.
So I suppose that brings into focus the idealisation of education, or the use of ideologies in education. Paulo Freire is an example of constructivist learning. Rousseau and the Emile and this naturalistic comprehension of learning, and leave the child alone, let them grow and let them play, and they'll learn. What would you say as a single response to people who make that case?
I'd say you're confusing the idea of how we construct learning with a pedagogy. So everybody has to make meaning. If I explain something to you, you have to make sense of it in your own head. I can't give you my knowledge. You have to form your own, in a sense. But the way I do that is through an instructional means. And you're more likely to have a more secure understanding of something if I use my expertise and my knowledge to guide you. And that's been studied thoroughly. So I think there's a philosophical sort of clash there. We still value the individual and then their knowledge, but we have to guide them towards it rather than let them flounder and struggle their way through to it.
You strike me, both Toms, as people who are very comfortable in your own skin in this world, you particularly in your world of explicit direct instruction, and then in the whole concept of the behaviour curriculum. Why is that?
I just think that I meet a lot of teachers that go to lots of schools, and I watch thousands of lessons, and I see children not learning as well as they could do, and often the solutions are very common. The mechanics of running a room, making sure everyone's thinking and having the chance to make sense of things, practicing, doing things. These are very common issues. They come up all the time. And I feel like if I was going to schools and couldn't work out what was going on and everything I thought made no sense, I would have to challenge my comfort. But actually I feel that this is the territory. And in terms of inclusion, making all the children be part of the learning process, those sorts of ideas, that Rosenshine principles and other things around that, help all learners be more successful. And I just find that that's the territory to be in, and it seems to make a big impact. So that's where I feel this is the stuff to be talking about. It makes a difference.
That resonates very much with exactly my experience. I am no better than many of the people here at this conference here today. I'm good at behaviour management, but what I have got is experience of thousands and thousands of classrooms, and in those classrooms you can discern the same aspects and the same practices which seem to work in most circumstances. It could be predictable behaviour, taught routines, high regard, boundaries, consequences, and so on. None of which is rocket science. I mean, I'm as insecure as anybody else is about themselves. But when it comes to observing what seems to work in the classroom, I'm fairly bullish about making sure that teachers know about very simple practices that help children to learn and seem to work everywhere you go around the world.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you. What a pleasure. Thank you very much.